Susan George has long been a figure who provokes strong reactions, not because of cheap shock value, but because of the fearless way she approached her career during a time when female performers were boxed into narrow expectations. When headlines scream that she goes bare and insist that pictures don't lie, what they often miss is the deeper story behind those moments and why they mattered. Susan George emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s as a symbol of a new, more daring era in cinema, one where actresses began to challenge the idea that they should be passive, hidden, or ornamental. Her screen presence carried a mix of innocence and intensity that made her performances unforgettable, and when she took on roles that required vulnerability, emotional or physical, it was never casual or meaningless. Those choices were part of a broader artistic statement about realism, honesty, and the raw edges of human experience. Rather than being about exposure for its own sake, her work reflected the shifting cultural landscape, where cinema was starting to explore darker themes, complex characters, and uncomfortable truths. Susan George's confidence on screen translated into a powerful kind of authenticity, and audiences felt that. The camera didn't simply capture her appearance, it captured her courage, her defiance of norms, and her willingness to inhabit characters fully, without apology. Over time, still images and scenes from her films have been pulled out of context and repackaged with sensational language, but the original intent was far richer. She was not chasing controversy, she was choosing challenging material at a moment when such choices could define or even derail a career. That risk-taking is a big reason she remains talked about decades later. Her legacy is tied not just to how she looked, but to how she made people feel unsettled, intrigued, and compelled to pay attention. In an industry that often reduced women to surfaces, Susan George insisted on depth, even when it meant scrutiny or misunderstanding. Looking back now, those much-discussed images function almost like cultural artifacts, reminders of a period when cinema was breaking rules and testing limits. They tell a story about artistic freedom, about a woman asserting control over her image within the framework of her craft, and about a time when audiences were learning to see actresses as more than idealized figures. Susan George's impact endures because she embodied that transition with rare intensity. The pictures may not lie, but they also don't tell the whole story unless we look beyond the surface and recognize the strength, intention, and artistry behind them. Susan George became a symbol of bold, boundary-pushing cinema at a time when few actresses dared to challenge convention. When people say she goes bare and claim the pictures tell the whole story, they often overlook the artistic courage behind those moments. Her choices were rooted in realism and character depth, not shock for its own sake. Susan George used vulnerability as a tool, helping redefine how women were seen on screen, and her lasting legacy comes from that fearless commitment to her craft rather than mere sensational headlines.